Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to Gender and Society. This is the lecture number 8 where we are going to talk about gender, family and marriage. So in the past few lectures we have seen that gender has evolved as a concept over time, as a social construct over time, and gender is also a very fluid idea. So it is basically a process that is continuously working, and it is some scholars have called it a work in progress. So addressing this fluidity of gender in family and marriage, what we will consider in this lecture is to look at some of the basic concepts that inform gender in family and marriage, and how the ideas, the three very basic concepts of family, marriage and gender actually work together to produce and reproduce some of the social patterns and processes that we see in societies. So we start by asking few basic questions here. What is the family, or how do we understand the family? What is marriage, and how are the two related? So what is the relationship between family and marriage? And they are both they have evolved into social institutions, and they are deeply interlinked, but we need to understand their relationship to understand how gender actually plays out in the whole process. Then we look at that how are social relations constituted and negotiated in family and marriage. So as you are well aware of, that family is one of the basic constituting elements of society, and while there are multiple definitions of family over time, as we have seen in scholarship, and to our individual understanding, we have seen that it comprises of social relations. So the nature of these social relations, they keep changing, so we need to understand that how are these social relations actually constituted within the family and constituted within marriage, and are these social relations actually evolving, and if yes, then how? So that is the third idea that we need to look at. And then what possibilities and choices are available for the individual in family and marriage within social systems that are unequal and hierarchical. So we need to examine, take it to a more critical level of analysis, of understanding that what are some of these possibilities, what are some of these choices that are offered to us within these institutions, and do these possibilities, do these negotiations or choices actually produce hierarchies, actually produce a hierarchical pattern, actually produce unequal patterns in society. So our understanding of gender, family and marriage will revolve around these few ideas. So to start with, we look at a family as a social institution, and this is just one way to define a family, is as a relatively long-standing social arrangement made up of stable set of values, norms, attitudes and behaviors that develop around a basic social need. So some of the components within this definition have remained unaltered, that it is a social arrangement, it is a social grouping. So it takes more than one person to become a family, and it is a relatively long standing institution in any given society. So it's probably one of the earliest definitions or earliest understandings of social grouping, that human beings actually form groups and they live in families. So and not just that, so this institution, family as an institution, is made up of a stable set of values, norms and attitudes and behaviors. And just to remind you, that these norms, attitudes, values, behaviors, however you want to describe them, they are also evolving over time. So if the constituting elements of a social institution are evolving over time, then it is not surprising that the social institution itself, the understanding of family itself, is also evolving. So we will start with this basic premise of understanding family. And we will also start with a basic understanding of marriage here as a social institution, where we want to identify what are the various types of marriage that we see in society, starting with monogamy, which is a sexually exclusive marriage with one spouse. And polygamy is the practice of people having multiple marriage partners. And polyandry is the practice of a woman having more than one husband. So these are some of the basic types of marriage relations that we see in society. Of course, societies differ in their understanding of marriage, and legally speaking, constitutionally speaking, societies have adopted their normative ways of understanding marriage as an institution. But from a social scientist or a sociologist's point of view, we need to keep in mind some of the basic types of marriage that we see prevalent in society. So the question of who marries whom is then becomes important, that exogamy is the practice of selecting mates from outside one's group. So we constantly see in any given society that we have this constant conversation, dialogue, that so we constantly see that in any given society we have a constant dialogue of who is going to marry whom, and whether this marriage is going to be taking place within the or outside the group. So depending on that, there are various types or practices of marriage, and exogamy in this case is the practice of selecting mates from outside one's group. So when I say group, I refer to a social group, which can be a religious group or a caste group. So whichever type of a social group that you may be referring to, exogamy is when this marriage is happening outside one's group. Endogamy, on the other hand, is the practice of selecting mates from within one's group. So when a person or a family prefers to have a marriage within their own group, then it is called endogamy. And the group may be based on religion, territory, racial identity and so forth. So as I said, that these groups may be in any one of these types of groups that a person or a family chooses as marriage. There is another thing that is associated with family and marriage, which matters when we talk about gender, is to talk about the place of residence. And place of residence after marriage. So in a patrilocal kinship system, and kinship is a term we need to clarify also, which I will do in the next part of the lecture. In a patrilocal kinship system, after marriage, a woman is separated from her own kinship group and resides with the husband or his kinship group. So, we see that depending on where the married couple lives after the marriage, actually forms a family structure or a type of residential pattern. And in a patrilocal kinship system, we see that after marriage, the woman in the married couple actually goes and resides with the husband or his family. In a matrilocal kinship system, we see that a woman continues to live with her family of origin. So, unlike a patrilocal system, in a matrilocal system, we see that after marriage, a woman continues to live with her family of origin. So, she does not actually go and lives in a separate residence. And a neolocal residence is the practice of the new couple establishing their own residence. So, a neolocal residential arrangement is where the newly married couple is neither residing with the husband's family or with the wife's family, rather they are actually establishing their own residence, their own home that is not a part of the husband's family or the wife's family. So, based on where a couple stays or chooses to stay after marriage, we have these three types of residential patterns with regard to family. So, now we need to understand that where does it all start for us to talk about gender in family, within the family. So, if you look at the history of how family dynamics have been changing over the years, over the decades, then you will see that most scholars, in fact if not all of them, they refer to the changing dynamics with regard to the household labor, which brought in a lot of significant changes within the family with regard to gender arrangement. So, throughout history, we will see that and this is the history of the world. So, it is globally seen that the division of labor that we understand have developed around the lines of biological sex. So, whether a person is born male or female, that has been the signifying factor for the division of labor for over the years. So, over time what has happened is the division of labor has translated to an understanding of the sexual division of labor, which is assigning particular jobs to particular sex categories. So, depending on whether you are a male or a female, you are assigned a job that is supposed to be your biological condition specific. So, scholars have actually tried to make meaning of this attributing of a signifying factor towards the biological condition, and they have found some sort of a refuge, some sort of an explanation in understanding child care, in understanding a child's dependency on mothers and fathers actually following the breadwinner model, that is to going out and earning for the family. So, this model if we see that in the most primitive of the models, in the hunting gathering stage, in the primitive of the societies, we do see that we see that the hunting was primarily done by males and gathering was primarily done by females. And when societies transition from the hunting gathering to the agrarian societies, we see that some of these jobs actually were reconstituted. So, what mattered is that the relative contributions of women's and men's labor to survival actually influence the degree to which each sexual category is socially valued. So what came over the years is an attachment of value or to measure or to signify what sort of jobs one is doing based on one's biological condition. And over time, because work became segregated over time due to the biological condition, what happened over time is that we see conditions of inequality in society. So we do see that women and men, they tend to be equal in societies where the value of their labor is more similar than in societies where the value of their labor is not that similar. So this is one way of looking at the transitions in the household labor within family, within marriage. So housework, it was seen that which typically consists of cleaning, cooking, paying bills, etc. That often gets translated as a gendered work once people start living together. For example, if you are staying alone all by yourself, you're pretty much doing the same, doing jobs of probably cleaning, cooking, or the household work that we understand to be consisting of everyday life. But the moment you start living with somebody or you start living in a family as a group, then the questions of who is going to cook, who is going to clean, who is going to go out and work, so all of these questions actually come up once people start living as a together or as a group. So housework gets translated as a gendered work in this. So gender establishes itself once more in this respect as a relational concept, that it is only prevalent, it's only possible or present when there is a relationship. So over time, what we have seen that the term housework did not appear in recorded scholarship until 1841, and this was pointed out by Hodgson and Sullivan in 1990, where they talk about that prior to the distinction, prior to 1841 when it was documented, the distinction between home and work probably did not exist, and even if it existed, it's not recorded in scholarship. So historically, if you see that gender has been a social organizing principle in societies, but also with gender there was age. So age, seniority, how senior you are in terms of age to another person was also a signifying factor in this social organization, particularly with respect to organization within family. So what happened is after industrialization happened in the US and the in the western part of the world, so the years after industrialization, we see that families actually responded to these changes that industrialization brought with it, and we see that they not only responded to these changes, but families consciously actually made these changes possible. So we see that the nature of work actually changed over time. So industrialization actually brought with it the knowledge about new roles, the knowledge about new job descriptions. And another thing that industrialization actually brought with it is the process of urbanization. So we see that more and more cities were formed, and there is a huge, we see a migration from rural to the urban, and particularly we see a change in the landscape of the city, particularly with respect to living arrangements. So we see that the working class population who now had to migrate from the rural areas to the cities for work, they preferred to stay closer to the where they worked, compared to the so-called middle class who preferred to maintain a distance from their place of work, and what they understood to be the suburbs, they used to prefer living there. So what we see that the working class, unlike the middle class around this time, that is after the industrialization happened, is did not really have, or did not really get a chance for this gender division of labor. So we see that working class women combined their household responsibilities with wage earning jobs. So and this is quite true for many societies in the world, including in rural India or rural parts of the world elsewhere, that we do not see the working class women or the categories of women we see there, that they have a strict gender division of labor, in the sense that they do not go out and work. They do go out and work. So this whole process of industrialization actually brought with it a complex evolution of understanding family systems, family structure, and the most important idea that it established kind of as a family model is the breadwinner homemaker model. So what we see that the process of industrialization actually brought with it a complex evolution of understanding the family structures, and one of the most significant things or models that industrialization actually put forward for us when we talk about gender family is the breadwinner homemaker model. So the breadwinner idea became entwined with male, and the homemaker model became entwined with the idea of the female. So and what happened is that it also the breadwinner homemaker model also brought with it an understanding of the separation of spheres. So if you try to look at housework or work outside the home, most people tend to think of these two as separate spheres, and the idea that these two can exist or possibly exist as an assumed understanding as separate spheres, as the men's spheres and the women's spheres, actually comes from here, from this part of history. So what happened is that in a way this arrangement of the breadwinner and the homemaker model actually brought with it an assumption that all workplace and workers are males, and with a second assumption that all of these males have stay-at-home wives. So in a way this also sanctioned non-participation of males in household work. So this is the history that has actually guided the birth and the growth of these spheres, these separate spheres, if we can if we want them to be separate spheres. And this homemaker breadwinner model actually came not just as a description of social arrangements, but it also came as a prescription, which means that it was also proposing that this is probably what the society should look like. So we see that with the change in the mode of production, in the employment sector, with the change of change in the nature of jobs, and primarily guided by ideas of commercial capitalism, we see that the homemaker breadwinner model came up as a doctrine to separate these two spheres, and as a prescription also. So we also see that scholars such as Jesse Bernard has actually say that the breadwinner model also made sure that men are not just providers, but they are also winners. So it's not called bread provider, but it's also called breadwinner. So there was a lot of discussions or intellectual exercise that were going on with understanding that are these two spheres really separate separate from each other, or are there overlaps, or do they actually exist? So with this we come to another understanding of labor force as we understand it to be the formal labor force around the 20th century. Actually it is found in scholarship that that there was an increase in the participation of women in the formal labor force, and it is it is to be clarified here that historically women have always been part of the formal labor force. So at least in most parts of the world that we see that women have always been part of the formal labor force. So what has changed probably around the 20th century which brought visibility to the idea is the idea that it is not as much the fact that female participation in the formal labor force is a new thing, but the size and composition of female labor force changed. So that is probably true around the 20th century and onwards, that it was not new that female we see a sudden inclusion of female labor force in the formal labor force, but we do see a change in the size and composition of the nature of the female labor force in the formal labor market. And one of the most significant changes in this respect from the 1960s onwards, as we see, is the entrance of married women with children in this labor force. So as you can imagine that until that time society had already organized itself based on certain principles that existed pre-industrial eras, and that industrialization brought with it. And we see that industrialization actually gave us an assumption by which we can actually judge what is men's work or what is women's work. So it has given us a lot of ideas, a lot of things to talk about, that these social arrangements we talk about, do they really exist, or are they socially constructed, and if they are socially constructed, then how and why and at what point of time did all of these come into action. So we see that these ideas of the separation of spheres was also brought with it the idea that women work inside the home, and the idea of the home was considered a place where spiritual values are upheld and maintained. So this is a history of how these ideas actually evolved over time, and where do we see that the men's sphere and the women's sphere actually coming from. So with that we also see that there is a changing family pattern, and we often talk about the extended family and the nuclear family. So there are certain questions to be asked in this respect. So the first question is the nuclear family universal, and is it found in every known human society? So at what point of time do we see that nuclear families started to grow in societies? And keep in mind that different societies pass through different stages at different times. So at what points of time do we see that nuclear families have actually arising in particular societies? Second is the nuclear group and the essential form of family. So, the way we understand family as a social group is the nuclear group, the essential understanding of the family, the only one that can carry out the vital functions of the family, especially bringing up the next generation, or can other family patterns be considered workable units for fulfilling these functions, such as single mothers, single fathers, two women, two men. So, the question then is that how do we understand nuclear family? Are we talking about the regular understanding of the heterosexual nuclear family here, or are we also including other family forms such as single parents and or the same sex families? So, we need to think through these questions. And the third issue that concerns the link between nuclear family household and the industrial society is that we see that in the old days, before we see the separation of spheres, before work moved outside the home to factories and offices, did parents and children live together under one roof with grandparents and other relatives? Did the nuclear family break away from this extended family system as a result of industrialization? So, in other words, is industrialization the cause of producing nuclear families in society? And much of these questions have been raised in the Western, so-called Western contexts, as industrialization actually started from that part of the world. But now more and more we see that the influence, the effects are felt in most parts of the world. So, as we are talking about gender and family and marriage, I want you to keep a critical eye to these questions, and these questions require a lot of discussions, and so I want you to keep a critical eye for these questions here that you see on nuclear families. So, now let us transition to talking about some of the theoretical lenses, some of the theoretical perspectives, sociological theoretical perspectives that we can use to understand family in society. And there are four significant perspectives that we can adopt in this respect: exchange perspective, symbolic interaction perspective, feminist perspective, and postmodern perspective. So, the exchange perspective talks about the idea that women exchange performance of household and child care in return of benefit from men's formal income. So, that is the exchange, one of the classical ways of understanding that a household labor is exchanged. Labor is in fact exchanged here. One is a informal labor, one is a formal labor. And it is true for both men and women. And it also, so this exchange perspective also talks about power dynamic that given that traditionally speaking, given the history, the formal labor force had been primarily the male labor force. So, females joining the formal labor force actually brings in a shift in the power dynamic. So, the exchange perspective talks with regard to that exchange of labor, whether it's informal labor or formal labor. The symbolic interaction theory or perspective talks about, this is again coming from a classic sociological understanding of the society, is the shared understanding of how people should act and create the basis of social roles that people play in society or in family or marriage. So, we have as a human society, as a and this is culturally specific, or some of them may be globally applicable, we have a shared understanding of these symbolic interactions that we assign, and we have signifiers. And so, our social roles or our gender roles in this case are actually guided by these symbolic interactions. The third perspective in this case is the feminist perspective, which brings in the idea that gender actually defines social roles and cultural characteristics. And this perspective says that biology or biological reasoning have no significant influence on these type of roles, on these type of gender roles in society, and these roles are culturally dictated, these roles are socially constructed. So that is the feminist perspective. And they also talk about the power dynamic that the exchange perspective refers to also, that the experience of living in a family for women and for men are different. So men and women, not to say that they are homogeneous categories, but people living in a particular family or as a group share certain power dynamic, or they negotiate certain power dynamic. And the feminist perspective looks at gender and the family in this respect and talks about this power arrangement and constant negotiation within this respect. The postmodern perspective addresses the various changes, social changes that have happened over the years, over the decades, starting from the mid 19th century to the mid or the late 20th century. And it looks at how the personal life of people have changed over the last few decades. So it brings with it an understanding that individuals, people actually move through a set of roles in society, and they often comes one after the other in progression. And we see that with more and more changes in lifestyle patterns, these roles are not always one after the other. So for example, in a popular understanding, if somebody is a student, somebody graduates and then finds a partner, gets married, have children, have a family, etc. But then we see that with changing lifestyles, one can continue to be a student and still get married and still have a family, although the struggles and the power dynamic may be different. But then it is still possible, given that how lifestyle patterns are rapidly changing in societies. So it also brings with it an idea that a person's self-identity is also reflected on with this idea of the postmodern perspective. So these are the four broad ways that we can use to understand how the arrangements, the negotiations within family and marriage can take place. There is there's actually a conceptual journey that family has made from another concept called kinship studies, and this is a classic anthropological concept that looks at mostly the biological perspective of whether a group is linked through marriage or linked by blood kin or through adoption. So kinship studies actually has been posited on a biological understanding of the arrangements in society, and the feminist perspective on the other hand actually talks about the politics of gender as we understand it to be the power negotiations, the power rearrangements that go on within the family in this respect. So with regard to central questions, the number of marriage partners permitted at one time, who is permitted to marry whom, how is lineage or descent determined, how property is passed on, where the family resides, how power is distributed. So if you adopt any one of these theoretical perspectives to understand family and marriage, you will see that depending on which lens you're using, you're getting a different power geometry, you're getting a different angle, a different version of understanding of a family. So with that, we need to now understand how do we define a family. So all of these gender negotiation, all of these power arrangements are going on and has been going on and will go on within families. So how is it that we define a family? So starting with the social conservative definition of family, we go back to the two-parent breadwinner homemaker model, that is the acceptable form, that it is the heterosexual two-parent model where the man is the breadwinner and the woman is the homemaker, and that is the social conservative definition and has been used extensively in the family scholarship literature. The second type of definition of families that we see comes from the economic angle, where not only is it talked about that rules about who qualifies to be a family member, that is who do you call a family member, and also the conceptual differences between household and family. So household refers to in economic terms, for conceptual differences, household refers to a group of people living under the same roof and sharing resources. And on the other hand, family refers to an ideological connection, not necessarily the people living under the same roof and sharing resources. So as you can see that families tend to live as households, but not all households are families. So this is a clarification I want you to have in your mind, that the conceptual difference between family and a household. And of course we have a cultural definition of family which varies from one culture to another, that if what do you understand to be family, say for example in a South Asian or an Indian context may be different from understanding of family in Europe or in Latin America or in the US. So and just to talk about it at the broad scale, even within smaller the broader scales, you have these nuances, these variations of understanding of family, and not just geographically but also through time. So if you take even for India, if you use it as a case, the ideas of what is family or who is family has changed over time, over the years. So it just shows that family is as much also a very fluid concept that keeps changing over time and through space. So now I want to introduce or briefly talk about some of the consequences that families have, or the type of family structures that we see in society. And we see that we have a direct consequence of family, consequence of gender on family when it comes to talking about the population at large. So now let's look at some of the impacts that gender has had on family as an institution, particularly looking at the South Asian context. So we talk in terms of population control, and I want to bring in the concept of sex ratio here for India. Sex ratio is used to describe the number of females per thousand of males, and this is how the Census of India defines sex ratio. And as of 2011, we have 940 females per 1,000 males according to the 2011 census of India. Now if you look at history, if you look at how has this the figures of the sex ratio looked like historically, you will see that in some of the earlier census for India, we have seen a higher sex ratio. So, for example, historically Bengal has shown a ratio of 1001 females to 1000 males. Mysore has shown 994 once, and Madras has recorded historically 990 per 1000 males. So, we have seen that the history has given us examples where this sex ratio was higher, where we had seen more females for every 1000 males. However, as we stand now today, we see that the figure is much less. That is one point to keep in mind as we talk about gender in the family. The other point to keep in mind here is to understand that there was a time when it was population control was the buzzword. So scholars, government policies, etc., everyone used to talk about population control, but over time we have seen that concept has actually transitioned to another concept of reproductive healthcare rights. So and this is again a conceptual journey that was made because when we talk about population control, we are taking away the agency, the rights over one's body from females, and so there was a need for this conceptual transition to understanding the reproductive healthcare rights and not just population control. So these are two fundamental ideas, two fundamental roots that will help us to understand how gender actually fares out in family in India. And this is from the Census of India. As you can see that these are the top 10 states where you can see a comparison between 2001 and 2011, where we have seen that at the national level we have 943 as our sex ratio. So as you can see that this is a comparison between 2001 census with the 2011 census figures. This is from the Census of India records that as of 2001 we see that the sex ratio was 933, and in 2011 we see 943. So there has been an increase in the sex ratio over time. However, it still is extremely low, and some scholars have called it that it's not normal to have such a low sex ratio. So what we see that this dialogue has been, this conversation has been ongoing for quite some time, at least in 1990, when we see that Amartya Sen actually published his work, where the title of that work is called "More Than 100 Million Women Are Missing," and he actually talks about the arrangement, the cultural arrangements or the cultural preferences across the country, as you can see on this map. So this map shows the child sex ratio in age group 0 to 6 as of 2011, and as you can see in the legend here that females per 1000 males in age group 0 to 6, the more you go towards green, the number of females per 1000 males actually rises, and the more you go towards red, the number decreases. So now on this map you can see that some parts of the country are greener than the other parts, and some parts of the country are towards the red part. So what Professor Sen has actually pointed out with respect to this map, that if you draw a line, say if you draw for example, I'm going to try drawing it here. So if you look at this map closely, and if you look at that, some parts of this map actually has more green areas than red areas. what Amartya Sen has pointed out, if you draw a line, an imaginary line dividing the eastern part and the western part of the country, you can see that much of the eastern, and the coastal part of the eastern coastal part of the country, and to some extent the central parts, are greener than the rest of the country. So the question is, does it bring with it a cultural understanding or a cultural preference that that actually produces a map of this type. So what he questions is that, is there a preference, a sun preference prevailing in the redder, the red parts of the country, and if it is the sun preference that is prevailing, then is the expectation that to provide more economic security to parents in the old age. So for the first question is it because a sun preference is prevailing, and the second question is it with an expectation that families and parents tend to have an idea that having a son is more an economic more of an economic security than having a daughter. And the other question that actually follows from here is an understanding that say we negate the previous question, say we don't assume that there is a sun preference, we negate the previous question and we ask a different question, that will this map change in the near future or in the distant future if the value and status of women in society is changed, if it rises, is the first question. And if women's contribution to the formal labor force is actually recognized as much as it is for men's, if we go towards a gender equal society with respect to formal labor force, then will this map change? So it's again a reflective question for you, that the first question was, does this map tell us that because there is a heavy sun preference, that we have several parts of the country with a very low sex ratio, and with understanding that having a son will give better economic security. And the second question, which negating the first question, so if we don't state the first question, if we just say that in general, if the status and value of women in society changes over time, will we have a different map? And if we recognize women's contribution to the formal labor force equally just as men's, then will this map change? So that is a question for you to reflect on as you understand this topic, as you read about this topic. But we do see that some of these preferences they have consequences of gender arrangements in family. So what the first consequence that we see that is really significant here is something that is understood as a marriage squeeze. And this is based on a study that was done by Ravinder Kaur and others, and there the scholars have actually talked about a situation where given this sex ratio imbalances, and they actually have pointed out three factors: the sex ratio imbalance, the age gap adjustments, and the effect of education gap. So it produces a consequence where we have a society where men do not find women to marry, and so it's kind of a squeeze in the marriage market, and that has actually brought with it several trends in marriage practices. And this is the title of a documentary that you can actually go online and watch. It's called "Bride Shortage in India Sends Girls far from home to marry. So there's this imbalance, not just in terms of female and male figures, but also regionally. If you see that some areas in the country tend to have more males than they should have, or some areas have more females, and so there's this bride shortage, marriage squeeze in other words, that actually sends girls far from their home to marry. And there is this very significant study done where they show that brides from Kerala are actually married to men in Haryana, and so this is a from one part of the country to the other. So these are trends that are actually seen, they are actually visible in society because of several of these gender impacts in family. And some scholars have also warned that there is probably a practice of gendercide, or how Warren in 1985 defined the deliberate extermination of persons of a particular sex or gender is the conscious or a constant removal of one particular sex or gender from a population. And there is a very nice talk that is available online. It's a TED talk where you can actually go again and take a look. This is the title of the talk, "The 3 Deadliest Words in the World, It's a Girl," and it's by Evan Davis, and you can actually go and take a look at this TED talk, which draws from some ethnographic studies to show what are some of the very dangerous consequences that can be felt in society because of certain cultural preferences. Bringing it towards the close of the lecture, what we see that over time the ideas of womanhood and manhood have changed, and not just over time but also through geographic scales. And we see that these perceptions and attitudinal changes in gender relationships have also changed over time, and that actually informs a lot of these power arrangements within families. We see that women's changing social locations in the family, social location as a concept, if you can recall from some of the previous lectures, that the assumption that women are participating in the formal labor force, unlike historically, which is not quite true. Women always participated in the formal labor force, but the assumption that is changing women's social location within the family. And particularly in the Indian context, particularly in societies that have had a tradition of understanding the joint family, how is the joint family imagined now? So is it still the ideal form of family that is understood definitionally, and what is the actual form of the family that we see in society now, and what are the actual forms of families that we see in society now? So I want to leave you with a couple of questions to think about and reflect. Family is usually related by ancestry, marriage, or adoption. So I want you to reflect on what is your definition of the family, and what are the changing gender relations in family that you can see around you, in the type of family that you are in, or in the type of society that you are in. So what are the changing gender roles, gender relations that you can see. If you are interested to read Arlie Hochschild's The Time Bind for a nice history of this changing family patterns, particularly with respect to gender, please give it a read. And then we'll continue talking about practices in family and marriage in the next lecture when we talk about the role of technology. Thank you.